gave up managing billions to become a better investor. Episode 16, Fun at the Bank of England. Hello. As I speak, it's been about 2.75 hours or so since the Bank of England raised interest rates by 50 basis points, slightly higher than expected, to a level of a 5% interest rate here in the UK. And that's kind of interesting, mainly because, of course, that's now back to the level last seen during the September 2008 Lehman Brothers crisis and related matters. So interesting times for at many, many levels. Also intriguing to see that 7 out of the 9 committee members of the Bank of England interest rate committee decided to raise interest rates. So is that kind of strange? What should we be thinking? And related, well, it's not that strange in the sense that I guess the Bank of England is an independent central bank. They are an entity, hence, who is primarily focused on reducing inflation or undertaking policy with the aim to do that over a period of time. So again, given the range of higher than average inflation numbers seen at the moment, no great surprise that the Bank of England has raised rates. Maybe, I guess for an independent central bank, not a particularly strange matter. But clearly it's raised a number of extra thoughts. There's clearly a lot of commentary going on. I see today in radio, TV, online and related. Clearly, suddenly, if you like, and I know we've had 13 interest rate rises over the last 18 plus months or so. So it's finally everyone is currently talking even more than ever, or more certainly for many, many years, about interest rates and inflation and related matters. So I thought I'd have a quick sort of podcast on what's going on, what am I thinking, and even more importantly, where are we going, and perhaps what it kind of means for things such as markets and related sort of broader financial sector matters. Kind of 5 key points really from the start. First is that policy always takes time to have an impact. And this is something which I see certainly on stuff that I've seen or heard already over recent hours. Few people are talking about this. Much of the focus is interest rates are this, bond yields are this, mortgage rates are that, and consequently this could be happening, or this is impacting us today, tomorrow, next month, rest of this year, etc. And all of that, I feel, is inevitably discussed. It's clearly very relevant from a today, tomorrow perspective. What I kind of find interesting always about interest rate policy and certainly central bank management of policy, and this is something I've observed over the last, I guess, 30 odd years or so since I've been looking at central banks a bit more closely than average, is that policy takes time. I mean, I hate to say this, but raising interest rates today, I know it's horrible and feels impactful, and people will say their mortgage is going up and consequently next month's expenditure is going to have to change. And all of that is true. And I acknowledge that and wish people luck and everything else. But the full impact of an interest rate increase takes somewhere between 12 and 18 months to work through. Now, maybe in today's world, with information being rolled out quicker, and certainly given where we are, perhaps in a broader economic cycle and various other matters going on in the broader global economy, you could say that that impact could be a little bit quicker. But my instinct is that 13 interest rate rises over the last 18 months or so, that the impact of those first sort of 6, 7, 8 interest rate increases, I don't think are even remotely fully impactfully occurring yet on interest rate policy, and consequently on where inflation levels are, or where they more importantly will be in 6 months' time or 12 months' time, or related. So that's my first observation. The second one is kind of intriguing. I mentioned bond yields a little bit earlier, and actually they haven't had that much discussion about bond yields. People have really been talking about interest rates and mortgage yields, which, you know, is fair enough. But bond yields are kind of an interesting thing, and bond yields have actually edged a little bit down, at least certainly 10-year bond yields, the ones I tend to look at from a kind of a medium-term perspective. And certainly during my days as an institutional fund manager and the like, even though primarily proportionally, I was much more of an equity investor. You had to make sure that you understood the bond markets. And even though I did invest in bond products, corporate bonds and related, as well as government bonds, nevertheless, you had to think about, well, what were the bond markets telling you in terms of the future? What were they kind of indicating? And I kind of find it interesting that bond yields, 10-year government bond yields here in the UK have edged back a bit, i.e. prices have gone down, but bond yields have gone down, hence prices have gone a little bit up. And that tells me that the concern about things such as recession or kind of slower growth over the medium term has gone up. And of course, I find that interesting because it kind of tells me that people are wondering whether policy is not only perhaps tight or has become tighter, but perhaps could be a bit too tight or tight enough to, yes, if the original and main objective is to reduce inflation, I guess that's going to be successful because you're going to get the second aspect, which is a recession, or the threat of a recession is kind of going up. That to me is what, despite some of the observations about inflation risks over recent days, the fact that bond yields have kind of edged down, those medium-term bond yields, I kind of find that interesting. Third aspect is the whole notion of core inflation versus producer prices and stuff like that. Because as always, as I said, I've been kicking around financial markets now for 30 odd years or nearly that now. And consequently, there've been many different types of inflation out there. It used to be called RPI when I was doing my economics A level and the like. We've now become obsessed with this CPI indicator. And of course, there are different types of CPI. There's a core measure, there's an overall measure. I mean, it gets complex. I'm not going to say you can find an inflation measure which suits you personally, but as I've talked about on previous podcasts, the most important inflation measure is what I call your personal inflation rate, which frankly, I know that many people would perceive that inflation was very low during the 2010s, but I think many of us who lived during those times, had a full, engaging kind of economic life, will talk about the fact that personal inflation rates were running around at 3-5% during the whole of that decade. And certainly personal inflation rates, which have become a bit more popular nowadays because inevitably people are saying, look at my shopping costs, look at my gas and electricity costs and related. Personal inflation rates have become a much more of a focus. So again, lots of debate about all of this. What I find fascinating, and I'll share the graphic on the podcast as well for your hopeful enjoyment, is that PPI numbers, producer pricing numbers, are actually somewhat lower. And I just don't mean a little bit lower than the 7, 8, 9%, perhaps even a bit more for certain food prices that you might want to cite or talk about or have seen quoted by people. But PPI numbers are running more like the sort of 2% level. Now that's kind of interesting because over time, and I know it is a little bit over time, but certainly over a reasonable year or so, you would tend to see what we would now call CPI, I say what we used to call RPI, and PPI numbers kind of doing roughly the same thing. Because over time, and I know there can be some extremities where this isn't true, but over time, the laws of supply and demand kick in, and as a consequence, these sorts of measures of inflation sort of move a bit together, certainly for an international trade economy such as the UK, with its imports and its exports, its access to different types of sectors and related. So I find it kind of interesting. And this brings me on to sort of the fourth point, really, which is what Tesco's said actually at the end of last week in their quarterly update, because Tesco's is an interesting company at many levels, but as a great insight into how investors should be thinking, I think it's super useful, super relevant, because of course Tesco's by definition for any supermarket company is wholly relevant for food discussions and related matters. But I think what Tesco's was talking about in terms of some of their own shifts which actually in terms of price of food I see as being copied, supported, influenced many other of their peers, unsurprisingly. And if you think about all of that, that's perfectly relevant. It's not just because suddenly suppliers become better, it certainly does help that there are a little bit less angst over certain difficult geopolitical matters. Shipping costs have come down. gas, electricity and related have come down. All of these things are very good for general underlying sort of producer price index matters, input costs and related. But we all know that there's been lots of discussion about, well, do we have a tight labour market? What rationale should there be for people to have XYZ increase in their wages? Is that possible? Is that smart? And related matters. And Tesco's actually talked about on their conference call just under a week ago about how, yes, costs of employment is still going up for the company, but what they're also seeing is the cost of their inputs, food and related matters, energy and associated matters, is going down. Hence, PPI numbers are coming down. And I've seen this sort of also mentioned by various other companies over the last couple of days I've been listening to with their corporate updates. Fortunately, these matters are getting better. Now, typically what I would expect, therefore, is over the next 6 to 12 months, by the end of this year, as we move into 2024 and the like, what we think is as CPI in its various forms is also going to come down. And I know that core CPI, employment-linked kind of measures seem to be stickier for various reasons, something which we'll touch on in a few minutes' time. But my observation is that I think, again, we come back to the laws of supply and demand, which are kind of important and critical. My feeling is, as all individuals, everyone, many people in the economy say, hang on, I've got to be a little bit more cautious. Maybe my mortgage is going up. Maybe my general costs are going up. Maybe XYZ is happening in the world of work and related. Consequently, I've got to be a bit more careful about spending money, about making sure that I can pay all the bills and related factors, all very sensible stuff. But as a consequence, think about the laws of supply and demand. As we've talked about already, how supply has not only gone up, fewer geopolitical issues, certain instincts on or costs on energy and shipping and related becoming more helpful for trading companies. But second, the fact that people are saying, well, hang on, supply's going up. I don't want to buy quite as much stuff. That supply demand kind of angle does suggest kind of the scope for lower inflation rates is going to get better, i.e. inflation goes down over time, let alone the fact where you get the comps, the comparisons indicator, which is one of the more horrible parts of kind of economic and macro and related matters, where people get all excited because suddenly your year-on-year comp becomes easy, or get very worried because of the reverse happening. And that's been so apparent over the last couple of years. I think as we've shifted for various reasons, geopolitical, macro, micro, various other factors, have shifted from sort of easy comps to tougher comps, and now we're kind of going to shift from tougher comps to easier comps. And as a consequence, you get that kind of natural flow. We've seen it, some of it already, in terms of the movement down of some inflation numbers. You could argue for things like house prices, how suddenly people are getting worried because house prices started to fall a little bit, but some of it is just the comps saying that I do think that house prices should come down a bit further, but that's another story, as they say. So it's kind of, I'm not worried about future inflation, actually. So kind of factoring in, it takes time for policy to have an impact, thinking about what bond markets are kind of indicating, musing about PPI, what Tesco's and many other companies are talking about, kind of intriguing. We then have government policy, of course. Now, it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that we have independent central banks, and I saw some people giving the government some grief over related matters, higher interest rates, higher inflation. And, we can certainly talk about governments and inflation in a few moments. But, of course, Bank of England is an independent central bank. So, therefore, we have this interesting interrelationship between the BOE, Bank of England, and the government, which didn't used to exist if you roll it back kind of, 20 plus years ago. Now, when I think about the government, their role, this is not a particularly political comment or anything like that, but generally the role of government is to think about matters such as the supply side. They whilst they should be concerned about inflation matters, interest rate policy is something for the central bank. However, on matters associated in a roundabout way with inflation and ultimately interest rates, a government can do some helpful things. For example, supply-side economics can be a great help if you have not only smarter people, but more smarter people being able to join the workforce, do a great job, add value for the economy generally. That should be good, not just for the progress of the economy, but also the fact that we're going to have less of these shortages and inflationary angst moments. That doesn't mean you can get rid of them all, because clearly there are always going to be some newer areas where there's a few geniuses and there's more demand. But over time, people are attracted to enter that sector because of higher wages and related, and the world shifts. But so long as you have those sort of supply side capabilities, those abilities to sort of shift an economy, that's a smart thing. That's the role of government, if you like, as well as business generally. Let's face it, governments unfortunately can't do everything, as we all well know. So you put all of that together and you say, well, government policy can be helpful here, particularly from a sort of a supply side perspective. Now, we can debate whether there's been good or bad or indifferent policy here. All I will observe is that you can't just click your fingers and boom, the change has been made. It takes a bit of time. And maybe that's something for the next election, and probably, actually, let's face it, the rest of this decade and beyond. But what I do observe is, even quicker than governments is always what the corporate world can do. And you don't need to be an extreme capitalist to know that typically the average company, be it induced by the profit incentive, is much quicker and much smarter at doing it, and probably can do it much more cheaply too. That doesn't mean governments can't do anything. They patently can, but unless governments are pushing sort of supply side reform, are also pushing sensible use of money, not trying to raise taxes too much and related, there are ways that a government can help an economy generally, irrespective of what underlying policies are also trying to induce. Now, what I observe at the moment is we've obviously got some perhaps some supply side issues, which are obviously trying to be sort of moved on. However, what I'd also observe is that, unfortunately, taxation, my instinct is probably is going up at some point later this decade. And consequently, how an individual, how a family reacts to that is pretty apparent. On average, people will be thinking, well, if taxes are going up, if interest rates are going up and related, I'm probably not going to spend that additional bit of money on doing something nice for the family, or going out and about, spending new car, whatever it might be. And so it has that ultimate impact over the medium term on house prices, growth, and to some extent, in a roundabout way, inflation. And actually, obviously, for inflation, it's a negative impact. It tends to mean that things such as inflation, house prices, general economic progress and the like tends to kind of go down. So this is when I'm thinking about, again, the aforementioned bond yield shift. I find that kind of intriguing because in a way I think, and again, the bond market is a good medium to longer term indicator. It is telling something quite smart and clever. And I think to myself, this tells me that maybe the Bank of England actually didn't make the right decision today. And as it happens, I've said it elsewhere, if it was my choice, I wouldn't have raised interest rates at all, not even 25 basis points. I'd have kept them unchanged because, as I say, looking over certainly from a lifetime perspective, the last 30 odd years of me actually watching what central banks are getting up to and whether the policies ultimately turned out to be smart or less so, I've observed that it's very easy to react quickly. And actually, where the mistakes tend to happen is very early in, if you like, the interest rate raising cycle, and right near the late point where you're kind of doing those final rate rises and the like. And unfortunately, I kind of feel that the Bank of England, the independent Bank of England, has kind of this time around made a couple of small little boo-boos. Now, as always, hindsight asset management is always the best performer. We all know that. And being a central banker is not easy at all. It's a tricky job, and probably it's smart that I'm not on their board, etc. But what I do observe is that when I think back to the end of 2021, when interest rates first went up, first in a long time in the UK, and frankly, the Bank of England started their interest rate hiking much quicker than, let's say, the ECB or even the Federal Reserve. So ticking the box for that. But what I would have probably done is we went from ultra low interest rates, almost near zero interest rates. I would have pushed that up to sort of 1 and a bit percent, click your fingers, do it almost immediately. That was because it wouldn't have completely changed the world for anybody. Yes, it would have been a bit of a shock for the bond market. I guess it would have been, wow, something is changing here. But actually, in terms of what really matters, which is whether people start to change their kind of day-to-day living, whether they choose to save a little bit more money in anticipation of more costs going forward, whether they perhaps don't buy that new exciting whatever it might be, which ultimately turns out to be inflationary or a not particularly wise expansion of the amount of debt you've got and stuff like that. Maybe that starts to kick in a bit more. And I've talked before about how I feel the 2010s was an aberration at many levels, and reality is much more, maybe it's just an older man kind of thinking about when he was growing up in the 80s and 1980s and 1990s or something. But I kind of feel as if those sorts of ups and downs we had then, but also actually the level of interest rates and related matters was actually much more kind of that kind of middle ground, which kind of doesn't particularly surprise me, or I kind of feel as if, why are we so shocked with mortgage rates being 6%? Frankly, when I last had a mortgage, admittedly many years ago now, I think the least I paid for my mortgage was 6 and change percent, and typically I was paying back my mortgage at 7-8%. You speak to my parents and they would have been talking about those days of halcyon days of 12-15% mortgage rates, etc., etc. You get the general point. So I'm kind of thinking that in a way, when I look back, the 2010s, it was a strange moment. And a lot of the issues we've got kind of playing out now is because many economic actors haven't actually seen some of those matters in reality. Sadly, that includes elements of the central bank committee, decision committee. Of course, there are many other things we could talk about. No, it's not just, let's blame the 2010s. That was because clearly it wasn't a horrible period. In fact, it was a great period at many levels. I'm sure many people would think that, but I kind of feel that people maybe did a little bit too much, went too beyond the kind of a range of normal, sensible, attractive, sensible, good, sustainable growth, sadly. Clearly, we've had some other issues in the interim period too. Sadly, matters in Ukraine, clearly, COVID, issues and lockdowns, which clearly hard to predict, but clearly impactful. I'll throw in Brexit, of course, obligatory mention, and no doubt for some people. But let's face it, it's something that was different. But clearly part of, as I've mentioned, the 2010s, COVID, Ukraine and geopolitical matters. And let's face it as well, some kind of hype and optimism about a changing, evolving world that I guess we could all access and still do, let's face it, online and related, where the world looks exciting and brilliant and our own lives look boring. And therefore, if we have an opportunity to buy something or have something, then why not take it now? Live for today, not for tomorrow type thing. You put all of that together and I'm not kind of surprised that we're at this sort of funny moment where there's a bit of inflation, there's an interest rate that many people are uncomfortable with, despite it not being particularly high, historically speaking. We've also got, haven't yet mentioned it yet, but mentioned in previous podcasts, a general aging population in the developed world, debt, people thinking about what they should be doing with their pension funds, obsession with house prices, of course, inevitably. And you put all of that together, and that's a very interesting mix. Look, as always, my general view on investment life is quite simple. It's an active investing world. That's what makes me excited as an investor across multiple asset classes, frankly. You don't need to be an equity-centered investor. Frankly, in all asset classes, clearly it's an active investing world. You've got to pick and choose carefully. Been the essential sort of message from the series of podcasts so far. I've got a feeling it'll be the central message of the next 50 or so over upcoming months, but we can have a listen to that in due course. I guess what I'm trying to say is my instinct as I'm looking at the Bank of England's decision I think they made a bit of an error in the sense that not only should they have raised rates a bit quicker, or certainly even if they kept the timing, they should have increased it faster, i.e. not 25 basis points, maybe 75, 100 basis points from the get-go. Boom. That would have kind of made the message a bit clearer. I think at this stage, we may be, late in that interest rate hiking cycle. I think they're also making a mistake by raising interest rates now, when actually I think at the end of this year, in 12 months' time, certainly, perhaps I'll embarrass myself by making a 22nd of June 2024 podcast where I see whether my thoughts on this date was correct or not. Embarrass myself, or congratulate myself for being insightful. Happy to do that if you wish. But my observation would be that maybe they should have kept interest rates unchanged, and actually that will look a correct decision by the time we get to the end of this year. We shall see, as always. All I do know is it's an active world, and it remains an interesting world, one you've got to think about carefully as an investor. But that's what makes the investment world interesting, I guess. So on that basis, I will draw a close there. Once again, I have sort of told you so little, and once again, I must close. But thank you again for listening, and I'll come back with another podcast in a few days' time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.